fiercely assail. In every speech it's the villain they unveil. From racism, patriarchy they rail. Ain't known, ain't nothing, and brave they prevail. Ushering in their Marxist utopias the end game. Turmoil and strife they aim to overthrow the old. Establish their claim in the vision they abolish everything. They need capitalism for the pain of clever life. These are the four goals of the woke. In actions, words they evoke. From pushing it way to Marxist dreams. In the dance of power, steam and steam. In every move, church and the queens. Remember, nothing's ever as it seems. So, instrumental. Gain power, stabilize, bring capitalism into the Marxist utopia. That's what they want, that's what they want. Abolish capitalism. These are the four goals of the woke. In actions, words they invoke. From pushing the claim to Marxist dreams. In the dance of power, steam and steam. In every move, church and the queens. Remember, nothing's ever as it seems. So,
Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum braucht er was zum Essen, bitte sehr. Es macht ihn ein Geschwätz nicht satt, das schafft kein Essen her.
Rum, links, zwei, drei, rum, links, zwei, drei, wo dein Platz genossen ist. Weil dich ein Indianerarbeiter einheizt kommt, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Mensch ein Mensch ist, drum hat der Stiefel im Gesicht nicht gern. Er will unter sich keinen Sklaven sehen und über sich keinen Herrn.
Rum, links, zwei, drei, rum, links, zwei, drei, wo dein Platz genossen ist. Weil dich ein Indianerarbeiter einheizt kommt, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Und weil der Prolet ein Prolet ist, drum wird ihn kein anderer befreien. Es kann die Befreiung der Arbeiter nur das Werk der Arbeiter sein.
Rum, links, zwei, drei, rum, links, zwei, drei, wo dein Platz genossen ist. Weil dich ein Indianerarbeiter einheizt kommt, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Здравствуйте, comrades. Yes, I'm aware that it is not Saturday. Okay, I need to update the introduction for these rare occasions where we get to do socialism in the middle of the week because, you know, our friends at Red May, I haven't really been happy with the content that Red May has put out for our traditional Red May, which is like last year, they put out so much great content. They really did. It was like we were watching socialism all the time. And now this year has just been, I'm not saying they're doing a bad job. I'm just saying I wish there was more, and I wish it was not quite as wonky. And but we got to take what we can get. And today we are going to be watching a stream live. We're doing this live. This is live, just like we did with James Lindsay yesterday. And it's funny because it's funny, right? Because we can, Josh Randall disavows. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate you. I wasn't mad at you for the super chat. I was the one that got the $15, all right? I appreciate you. Thank you. Okay, so Red May is so what I think is ironic is, of course, all of James Lindsay's fanboys yesterday were bitching and complaining that why is my video I don't even guy got to restart Chrome or something. Whatever, you guys are gonna have to deal with me being a little bit like pixelated or something today. I don't know what's going on with my Chrome. Anyway, James Lindsay's fans yesterday were like, how dare you stream snipe James Lindsay? But are any of them going to complain that we're literally doing exactly the same thing with socialists today? Like, we're doing to the James Lindsay supporters were calling us all socialists and communists yesterday. Today, we are literally doing the same thing to socialists, real socialists, revolutionary socialists, that we did to James Lindsay yesterday. Exactly the same thing. So I can't wait for the Lindsay stans to come out and complain about the fact that I'm showing real socialist training live. And actually, unlike James Lindsay, I don't even think these guys pre-record their stuff. So we're going to get to ask them questions. It's going to be great. We are watching on Red May, and Red May is hosted by Radical Revolutionary Socialists in Seattle. During the month of May, this is an annual event that Red May does where they have all sorts of socialist content. And if you are in the Seattle area, you could actually go to their live content, and you can go find their schedule over at redmayseattle.org. They do have some stuff in person. They're doing movies. They're doing stuff like that. But we, sadly, because I am in New Hampshire, a long way away from Seattle, am relegated to the YouTubes, all right? And today we're going to be watching a presentation. It's getting started in about 8 minutes, called Radical Politics on the Causes of Contemporary Emancipation. And let's just look at the description. How should radical political movements relate to the state? What makes emancipatory politics fundamentally different from both the technocratic and populist models of politics as usual? Which forms of organization are most likely to deepen and extend the dynamics that led to the emergence of these movements in the first place? Offering a new reading of Gramsci. It's my understanding, and someone correct me if I'm wrong. I don't read the philosophy, as you guys know. I leave that to other people. Gramsci is basically responsible for the idea of taking over cultural institutions. Am I right about that? Correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. Offering a new reading of Gramsci, Peter Thomas considers how to engage productively in radical politics and counterintuitively explain why hegemony is a method of doing politics rather than an end goal, offering a distinctive and forceful contribution to ongoing debates about the nature and orientation of contemporary emancipatory movements. And what I thought was interesting is Michael Bray is moderating this. Didn't Michael Bray write the Antifa handbook? I'm pretty sure Michael Bray wrote so Gramsci came up with the Long March Through the Institutions. That's what I was saying. Like Gramsci came up with the idea of taking over the institutions, like to like shift culture. Thank you, Human Centipede. So apparently we're getting a new interpretation of Gramsci today, which I think is interesting. As a reminder, anytime you see the term radical in this sense, what they mean is, obviously there are other groups that use the term radical too, like Ninja Turtles and surfers and probably things like that. But like when you see the term radical in this sense, you're going to get basically the most radical revolutionaries. This is as far left as you can go. So that's what they're talking about. This is not Democrat. This is not remotely Democrat. This is not progressive. This is not democratic socialist. This is as far left as you can go. Oh, Mark Bray wrote the Antifa handbook. Okay, so this is Michael Bray. So this is a different one. I wonder if he's related to Mark. I wonder if they're related. I don't know. We're gonna watch this today, guys. It gets started in about 6 minutes. Now, Potato has entered my chat. You guys all remember Potato from the other side of the internet. Potato, I don't mind that you're drunk. I just want you to know that this is a socialism stream. This is serious business. You're allowed to be here. Just don't be too disruptive, okay? That's all I'm asking. You're allowed to be drunk. You're allowed to be fun. Just don't be too disruptive. Or if you're going to be disruptive, at least do like Josh Randall disavows and give me $10 or something. That's all I'm asking. All I'm asking, you know? Potato does drop by from time to time. We don't mind Potato. We don't mind him. He can hang around. It's fine. Look, Potato, bot is only a little high. But this is a class, okay? When we do socialism, this is serious business, and we are going to be reacting on the internet live to real radical revolutionary socialists. So guys, please do mount the like button for me as we're waiting for this to get started. Mounting the like button lets YouTube know to actually recommend my content for once. It really does make a difference. So please, there's per usual a shocking disparity between the number of people watching right now and the number of people who have mounted that like button. I do appreciate it. Also, do remember to head over to my Substack, which is Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com, and sign up for email subscriptions. You can actually, Potato, this is going to be excellent for you if you're trying to learn more about James Lindsay, because later today, I was actually almost about to do it before I went live, and then I had other things to do. I will be releasing a new episode of the Actively Unwoke podcast where I basically take everyone through what happened yesterday with us taking over James Lindsay's stream. We've got a whole list of questions that we now know we're not allowed to ask, and things we're not allowed to say when it comes to James Lindsay. Like, we're not allowed to say the goal of queer theory is to abolish capitalism. We're not allowed to say that the purpose of Drag Queen Story Hour is to teach children that gender is a performance. We're not allowed to say the word capitalism at all. And we've now got a whole list of guidelines because yesterday James Lindsay banned like dozens of people permanently from new discourses because they said the word capitalism. Now, saying I'm not even going to say the word that you're allowed to say on his channel. It starts with F and rhymes with maggots. That word is totally okay in James Lindsay's chat to call someone a word that starts with F and rhymes with maggots. In fact, James Lindsay's supporters were calling us the word that starts with F and rhymes with maggots, and that was totally fine with James. James had no problem with that, but you say the word capitalism in the new discourses chat, and all of a sudden you're permanently banned. So that is going to be going up on the Actively Unwoke Substack a little later today. And I'm going to be leaning into podcasts, guys, pretty heavily for a little while because it seems like people are really liking the podcast format. It's a format that I had neglected for a long time. There's a lot of podcasts I want to record, and I will be posting them there. Both the Actively Unwoke podcast and also the Inner Circle podcast, which is the premium supporter-only podcast. So if you want access to all the goodies, sign up for $8 a month, $80 a year, and support the work I'm doing. I really appreciate it. Josh Randall disavows. Josh, is our mutual friend going to be mad at you that you're giving me all the super chats and you're not giving him the super chats? Because I mean, he hasn't even been streaming lately, so he has nothing to say about this, I guess. So everyone on Big Tech's channel is welcome to bring their super chats over here. I don't like, he's not streaming it. I appreciate you. Yes, we know what you meant. Yep. All right. We should be getting. What did he do now? He hasn't even been online. Like, what is it? You know what? I don't want to know. I don't want to know what you guys are getting up to. I don't want to know. All right? Just try to keep me out of it and try to not post memes where I look like a 400-pound woman. That would be fucking great. If you guys could just stop doing that, that'd be fucking great because I'm actually not 400 pounds. I'm not even 300 pounds. I wear normal size clothes and everything. I don't know why you guys got to post those memes. I don't get it. Not even 200 pounds. Like, Jesus Christ. Anyway, we're leaving that alone for right now because we are about to get into our episode of Red May. Well, thank you, Potato. Now you're saying that drunk, so I don't necessarily know that that's true, but that's okay. That's all right. I appreciate the sentiment, Potato. Thank you. All right. We should be getting started anytime here. Now, as a reminder, if you guys are going to go over to their chat, don't fucking embarrass me, okay? We train for this. We know we know the right questions to ask. The goal with this is not to shitpost. Do not shitpost. Do not shitpost. Do not shitpost. The goal is to ask good questions to get them to say the quiet part out loud. And they're talking about Gramsci, so we can talk about their strategy. Like, we can ask them about their strategy of taking over institutions. We can talk about how they took over education. We hopefully will get some we can hopefully get some more information about, like, if are they planning on doing more institutional takeovers, stuff like that. So stuff like that. Oh my god, why is everyone here? What are you guys are you guys like talking about me in the Discord or something? Why is everyone here from the other side of the internet? This is like when you start seeing teachers and classmates outside of school. You guys come from the other side of the internet, okay? Like, I don't know, like did you catch a plan? Like, I mean, I don't mind that you're here. I'm just saying, like, it's like seeing people outside of school, okay? It's like out of context and it's confusing. And we're about to watch Socialism. I have made many videos explaining it. I've made many podcasts explaining it. The short story is James Lindsay is lying to his audience. He knows he's lying to his audience. We know he's lying to his audience, and he knows we know he's lying to his audience. And we are not taking this shit lying down. We think people deserve to know the truth. And I posted many videos and podcasts about it. James Lindsay has also shit talked me multiple times on the internet. He's doing everything he can to discredit my character. He has blocked members of my community. He's told his followers to block me and members of my community. James Lindsay is the one that started this stuff. James Lindsay is completely incapable of engaging in an intellectual discussion about ideas. He just tells everyone to block everyone else, and that's his only strategy. But we're going to be hinged into reality here. That's why we're watching Socialism. All right, let me just reload this. Just make sure it hasn't started yet, because sometimes it does. Okay, we're still waiting for Red May. Hopefully Philip will make an appearance. We did have a confirmed Philip sighting the other day, so Philip is still alive. We know he's with us. His kitchen looks exactly the same as it did last year, except there's like a wig sitting on Philip's counter for some reason. But I hope we have a Philip sighting. If you don't know who Philip is, don't worry. Oh. Human Centipede has not yet met Philip. Philip is a graduate of Columbia. He is a radical revolutionary socialist in Seattle, and he is the organizer of Red May. And Philip is a character. He is a character. But we don't always see Philip. You guys are going to get to know Philip. Some of my earlier Socialism Saturday episodes will introduce you to Philip. Yeah, I was not at all surprised to discover that Philip was a graduate of Columbia. Not at all surprised. They're all graduates of Columbia. Yes, Sean, the most handsome of all socialists, is also with Red May.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism.
Philip, we missed you.
A few days ago, we did a panel called Money Has No Value. Now, that's just value form theory, but money has a great deal of value for us. It's what allows us to keep doing Red May. We've done it
Everyone
8
say
times,
hello
and
to Philip.
we're pushing towards our 10th anniversary. To do that, we need donations. We depend on the kindness of strangers. If you want to give to us, or you want us to keep doing
Philip has a wig on his countertop.
Here are a couple of options. You go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org. There's a button that says donate, and you can become a Patreon member there, giving monthly donations. Or if you want to hit us with one fell large donation, or whatever denomination, you can go to Fan the Flames of Red May. That's our GoFundMe. Or Take a Break from Capitalism. Is it Fan the Flames of Red May still, or have we changed it to Take a Break from Capitalism, Kyle? Do you know? Oh, well, you go there and you'll find it out. So quickly, I want to pitch 2 panels to you that are coming up on Wednesday and Friday. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. we have Scott Aquano and Steve Maher talking about the fall and rise of finance, American finance. They have a book out from Verso. That's great. On Friday at 4 p.m., a panel called The Horror of Fleece, based on Travis Linneman's new book. It's not just that police are a horror, it's that horror movies are the best mechanism for understanding police. He'll be on the panel there with Jean-Darca Corti and Jared Shanahan. So check those out. And now I'd like to go to a panel I'm very excited about. It's based on Peter Thomas's great new book, Radical Politics, on the causes of contemporary emancipation. Peter's the author of The Gramscian Moment. And I'd like to introduce you now to the moderator of the panel, Michael Bray, who's professor of philosophy at Southwestern University.
Thanks so much, Philip.
Professor.
You preempted me. I was going to hold up my copy of the book, so I'll do it too. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to have a panel on Peter's book. It'll be followed. Peter will give
Edwin's
20
over in their
minutes
chat.
or so presentation on the major themes
Edwin,
of the
I was
book,
thinking
and then
about
it'll
you the
be
other day and how great your
followed
voice
by
is.
3 responses, one from me, one from Max Tomba, and one from Banu Bargu. I'll go ahead and introduce everyone, and then I think their faces will begin to magically appear on the screen as I do so, and then we'll leap right into the discussion.
How is my volume?
The author of the book, of course, is Peter Thomas. He is professor in the history of political thought at Brunel University, London. In addition to this book, as Philip mentioned, he's the author of The Gramscian Moment and serves on the editorial boards of Historical Materialism and the International Gramsci Journal. Banu Bargu is professor of history of consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz.
Oh,
she is the author of 2
University
books,
of
Starve
California.
and
I
Immolate,
know we're
The
shocked.
Politics of Human Weapons.
That's
and
where
the
Angela
forthcoming
Davis
book,
teaches too, I think.
Disembodiment, Corporeal Politics of Radical Refusal. She's also the editor of the journal Political Theory. And our final panelist is Max Tomba, who is professor and chair of the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is the author of many books and articles, including Marxist Temporalities and Insurgent Universality, an Alternative Legacy of Modernity. He's currently working on a new book titled Revolution and Restoration. Welcome to everyone. Thank you to Philip and to Red May.
Thank you, Philip.
I'll turn it over to you, Peter, to begin.
I'll see if there are subtitles. No subtitles, sorry.
Great, thank you very much to Philip and to Michael and to Banu and Max for joining us this evening. I do have a copy of the book here, but I won't hold it up as Philip and Michael have already done the obligatory promo slot. So what I thought would be useful for me to do tonight is maybe just give some sense of the overall shape of the book and some of the themes I was trying to deal with, or the context from which it emerged. Fundamentally, the book is an attempt to come to grips with some of the central debates in radical politics over the last 30 years or so. And I was looking to think of a whole variety of different radical political movements around the world, some of which I may have been involved in, many of which I've taken an interest in from afar, and to think about some of these movements outside some of the dominant narratives that I certainly had received as a young leftist growing up into different traditions, and I think is probably one that many of us share. So those dominant narratives, I think it'll be familiar, as I said, to many of you, pretty much told us that we'd arrived too late, that the high points of radical politics in the 20th century had already occurred.
I'm going to turn up their sound a little bit.
1917, maybe
Ooh,
might be
loud.
back in a mythical 1968 or wherever it might be. And we'd come along afterwards, as it were, and we could only have some type of a nostalgic, perhaps even narcissistic relationship to previous instances of radical politics. And our
Better to
lot
be too
in
loud,
life,
probably, though, than not
was to
loud
be some
enough.
sort of an afterthought. a footnote.
Oh,
to
now
the
it's
grand
probably or
historical,
crackly. Okay, well, I'll turn it back
events
off then. I'll turn it back to normal
of the
sound.
past.
Is
Perhaps
that better?
holding the fire, keeping the faith with those previous radical traditions, but in some ways not really fully a part of them, something separate, an afterthought. And I was trying to think through different ways of
Okay, I just
radical
turned the
politics
plug-in
over the
off,
last
so
30
it should
years,
be
which
back
to
to
my
normal.
mind had exhibited and continue to exhibit incredible forms of creativity in all sorts of different directions, and think about them in a perspective that acknowledged their vitality and perhaps even more so their actuality, rather than comparing them to some standard of seasons of previous politics. So in part, the book was an attempt to think of the present not as a disappointment, but as filled with various potentials, perhaps latent, perhaps unrealized, but still a process that was ongoing. And I was trying to look across different movements, from movements in the 90s, say, against declarations of the New World Order, the great anti-war movements of the early 1990s, across important international instances, such as the Zapatista rebellion and the international solidarity movements. They inspired alternative globalization mobilizations around the world, particularly culminating, I think, in the so-called Battle of Seattle. So we've got certainly an important tie in there to some of the themes from tonight. Across all the anti-war movements, we saw at the turn of this century in the movements against the so-called war on terror, various student movements, anti-austerity movements, and so forth, going across all of the incredibly vibrant movements of the last decade or so, which again, thinking through the rapidity of their development, movements such as the international women's strike, movements of various forms of
Please
anti-racism,
no arguing
Black
with
Lives
Potato
Matter,
in the
obviously very
chat. Just
significantly, but also
relax.
important anti-racist mobilizations around the globe
Relax and
over the
listen.
last years. And a whole series of events that emerged out of the pandemic and coming through, although these events are occurring after the publication of the book, to the profoundly important moments concentrated on the global struggle against apartheid, and this present instance obviously focused
Is
in
he?
particular
Why would he be
on the
watching
ongoing
this? This
struggles
isn't even that
in
interesting.
Palestine. And to think about these movements in a way, not as discrete or separate
I
instances,
doubt very
but
much
to
he's
try
watching
to
right now, but
understand what
thank
was
you.
going on with those generationally, in their differences just as much as their unities, and try and find some sort of pattern or grammar that we might be able to use as a way of understanding their interrelationships. And what I kept coming back to, seeing the way these movements had unfolded in different directions, was thinking about all of the learning that had gone on in these experiences within discrete, smaller generations, as you were, over the longer cycle in different forms of inheritance, but incredible learning experiences in which new generations of leftists and radicals had been able to experiment with different types of politics, to pose themselves some questions that I'm sure, to many of us as we were much younger and maybe got involved in some of these movements, seemed to us terribly new and important insights, but we then discovered, as it were, through practice and experience and through study, just how much we were inheriting all sorts of debates that had been forgotten for a long period. And the way those types of dimensions or redimensioning of historical consciousness then retroacted upon engagements and debates in movements as they further unfolded.
Hang on. I want the Potato arguing in the chat to stop.
Make some sense of it, that there were
We're actually here to listen to this, not to watch you guys go to the Discord and have this conversation if you guys want to do that.
For those who are engaged in radical emancipatory politics, very, very simple ones in a sense. They were so simple, it seemed banal, but sometimes it's the quite obvious questions that are the most interesting ones to really try and think through. So the sort of questions I saw each of these movements posing themselves in different ways was, well, firstly, what's the point of all of this? What are we aiming to achieve by engaging in radical politics? What's the nature of radical politics? What are we up to that defines our politics as radical or emancipatory, as opposed to the various other types of politics in which one might engage? What are the particular ways we're doing this politics that makes it so radical? And how should we go about organizing these struggles to give them some sort of consistency, or perhaps not even, perhaps simply in order to enable them to achieve some of their immediate objectives. And I was trying to think through his questions and how to make sense of them, but also crucially, their
Probably
repetition, as it
appreciate
were,
if
'cause I
you
noticed
sent
they
him the
kept
super chats, but
recurring
I'm not going to
again in their
complain.
simplicity in different
I'll
movements. And the
take the super
responses different
chat.
movements would give to the questions would
It's true.
obviously be different and depend upon
He is.
particular contexts and histories and so forth. But I thought there were some important red threads linking through them in terms of the immediate responses movements are giving on the ground to these problems. But then just as crucially, the way movements were translating each other or looking across to recent experiences and trying to learn from those experiences, connecting the dots.
How is my
so to
volume
speak.
compared to theirs?
So in the book, I try and bring these
Okay.
together, and in the way seems obligatory in academic discourse, come up with what might be regarded as a relatively pretentious way of formulating the problem via a reference to Aristotle's conception of causation, or what I call in the book an ideology of contemporary self-emancipation. So looking back to some of the ways Aristotle discussed causation in terms of final, material, efficient, and formal causes. And I found that useful as well in a sense, because the conception of causation we find in Aristotle is quite distinct from many more modern notions of causation, which often get mixed up with various conceptions of intentionality, subjectivities, notions of origins and effect, and so forth. And I was much more interested in the structure of the thinking that Aristotle's approach can give us in terms of thinking about what it is that makes something what it is, and what it is that gives something certain types of potentials to develop in different directions. So I wanted to think about those sorts of questions in that frame, and then part of my problem became, well, what concretely do I do with this, or how do I explore these sort of four causes more concretely and more conceptually? And here I found myself turning to Gramsci. Partially that's for personal biographical reasons that I've spent some time in my life studying Gramsci's, I think, endlessly fascinating work for different reasons. Partially, I think there's a, as it were, objective claim to Gramsci's relevance here as one of the great and most creative revolutionary thinkers of the 20th century. I think it probably never hurts for us to look back and try and catch some light from his work in relation to contemporary problems. But more importantly, it was because I thought Gramsci gives us something quite distinctive as a way of thinking about our relationship to different types of politics and to different periods in the history of radical politics. And that's namely in his conception of translatability, which is a concept that for a long time in Gramsci had been relatively neglected. But I think recent discussions have really put an emphasis upon what sort of a creative and original theorist of translation in the widest sense, not just linguistic translation, but the whole problem of what it means to translate experiences from one context to another. That gave a certain angle to think about problems.
He's giving us a lot of word salad today. Just sit through it, just lean into it.
We might be able to translate Gramsci from his fascist prison cell in the 1920s and 1930s into the 2020s. But even more importantly, the sort of relations of translatability that underlie any of our attempts to relate to Gramsci in that historical context. So that means also then, as it were, not just translating Gramsci into the present, but translating back some of the questions we're posing to ourselves today, and
I
getting
can't
those
fix
to
their sound, guys. I don't hear a crackle.
Gramsci expressed, which I think opens up some space to read Gramsci in quite different ways than might have been available in previous political conjunctions, some of the more canonical readings of Gramsci. So the attempt of the book then is in a way to think through the ways Gramsci might be relevant to the present, but also the way the present might be relevant to Gramsci, and help us to rethink those dual relations in a dialectical fashion that enriches our perspectives on both of them. So that sort of led me then to try and explore these four causes.
So how is Gramsci relevant?
I'll provide a sort of brief resume of some of the themes I was grappling with there, or telegraphically communicate the results, as it were, of my thinking around issues. So firstly, in terms of so-called final cause, here I was concerned to engage with a lot of the debates that have constantly come up over the last years around the way in which radical politics should be relating to the problem of state power. It has been a very significant one in the early 20th century. And I think in many respects, you can look back over experiences of the last 20 years and see them reposing some very
When he says state,
debates
he
that have
means
occurred throughout the
capitalist
history
state.
of Marxist and radical thinking, but particularly from some of the incredibly rich seasons of discussions in the 1970s around the globe. The whole issue of what to do with state power, how to relate to it, how to deal with the problem maybe of eventually having to assume, as it were, the commanding heights of state power, as we saw quite noticeably in various experiments across Latin America over the last 20 years, have been fundamental issues the contemporary radical left has had to deal with. And one thing I found particularly useful in thinking with Gramsci around these problems is the fact that he elaborates a very sophisticated state theory that goes beyond various conceptions of mechanisms of domination or oppression, or even simply
Ain't that the
exploitation in a technical Marxian sense, but tries to encompass
Go
that in an
tell Big
overall
Tech that.
conception of what Gramsci calls the bourgeois integral state, as
when you
a
send him
relation
in
of
a super chat or
generalized
something, tell him
subalternization
a
and
man's
sort of core logic to the way in which political modernity has elaborated a continuous negative dialectic between instances of association from below and instances of organization from above. And thinking through these problems with Gramsci, I think, helps us to see the way in which the state is not something that could simply be avoided today through some type of a process of exodus, as some say more movementist perspectives have argued very eloquently in recent years, nor is the state something that could quite so simply just be seized or smashed, given its infiltration, as it were, as a fundamental logic of relationality in modern societies. It's a particular type of relationality that needs to be deconstructed by militant revolutionary action. And
militant
here I try
revolutionary
and link up Gramsci's
action.
thinking around those problems with ways of reconceiving conceptions of dual power and how they might be relevant for us to understand the types of potentials contemporary movements have or may not have in relation to revolutionary traditions, discussions of such a notion. That then brought me to thinking in terms of a material cause about the nature of politics. And in some ways, this was an attempt to develop a critique of the recurrent tendency of radical politics, perhaps since forever, certainly since the 1960s, to fall prey to a certain temptation of imagining some space of a purer politics where hands are not quite so dirty, whether that's the type of politics that is founded in some form of social legitimacy or in some conception of an ethical intensity that lies beyond the compromises of state power. The conception that a radical politics somehow is defined as such by its capacity to subtract itself from an existing situation and try to find some vantage point uncontaminated by the compromises of the present. What's particularly interesting here in Gramsci's dialectical and historicist approach is that I think he provides a very interesting perspective on the problem that politics as we know it is precisely what we've got. And that's precisely part of the problem, that it is politics as we know it, whether in an official sense in terms of bourgeois representative institutions or the types of oppositional politics acting in reaction to those official politics. There's the reality, as it were, of the political field, and it's precisely that dimension, insofar as subordinated to the subalternizing dimensions of the bourgeois integral state, that constitutes the problem to be overcome. The difficulty then becomes one of how does one practice truly radical politics in a context where necessarily your hands are going to get dirty in relating to the established political structures and forms. And so that can be in the official representative bourgeois institutions. It can also be in
bourgeois institutions. That's referring to our government, bourgeois capitalist government
that become a part of the way in which oppositional politics reacts to that status quo. But the difficulty then is one of finding a mode of practicing politics that would, in a sense, be an antidote to the subalternizing dimensions of the bourgeois integral state and represent some capacity to deconstruct it or to de-subalternize the nature of politics itself. So on that point, I'm then led to pose questions about the so-called efficient cause of this radical politics, or to ask, well, how is it possible to think about politics in quite different ways? And here I'm interested to explore more some of the debates around notions of hegemony, and to question some of the dominant ways that we've understood hegemony in the past. Comrades will remember there's been some very interesting debates about the death of hegemony, or after hegemony, or post hegemony, and often many of those discussions have presupposed a conception of hegemony.
God. I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse,
some
Autumn.
type of leftist euphemism for a notion of sovereignty, or conceives of it as a generic description of a certain type of power, perhaps even a power of command, or that thinks of hegemony as an alternative type of historical narrative to explain the emergence of historical power. We can certainly find in Gramsci's work all sorts of different perspectives that can gain many insights from those dimensions of Gramsci's thinking. And we can think about some of the great theoretical projects elaborated over the last 30, 40 years, work like Leclau and Moose work, Rani Guha's work, Giovanni Origi's work, various different prismatic lenses.
The leader of the
onto
takeover
hegemony.
of the institutions.
What interested me more was to explore another dimension in Gramsci's work, which I think has maybe
what's
less
stopping
acknowledged. And that's not so much what
I didn't say no.
mean as a concept, and it's more what Gramsci was trying to do with the concept of hegemony, which is a term he inherits from his engagement with the Bolshevik debates when he was in Russia in the 1920s, and tries to think out in relation to the context of his responsibilities as the leader of the Italian Communist Party, and later in a fascist prison cell. And here I'm very interested in thinking how Gramsci understands hegemony as a distinctive method of political work, which I see configured around four sort of broad thematics. Firstly, around the notion of a radical form of leadership that in some ways tries to put itself out of business by encouraging the followers of yesterday to become the leaders of tomorrow, by thinking about the capacity of hegemony to posit the problem of the necessity of a new order on a civilizational scale, maybe a problem we often shy away from or have in the past. He also poses quite bluntly, in ways that I think might seem quite heretical to us today, the necessity to advocate for the possibility and indeed the necessity of historical progress, conceived in a non-teleological form as a process of problem solving by popular movements and the radical impulses that underlie them. And finally, a conception of hegemony as what I call sort of laboratory, a process of experimentation, an attempt by the movements to learn from themselves in the process of the movements. So by engaging in radical politics, attempting to further and understand the distinctiveness of the type of politics that you're doing, in a sort of fusion of means and ends.
Kind of glazed over.
So that then brought me finally to a sort of the formal cause, as it were, to think about, well, what's the form of radical politics that makes it different? Or to translate into our very contemporary language, how do we get organized? What have we got to do? What type of organization?
Yes. What organizing do you have to do? That's a great question. Answer that.
In the sort of radical change that we envisage. And here I look around a variety of.
Gramsci is the person who came up with the Long March through the institutions.
The political party, the need to think beyond the party, maybe to
He's
think
the
about
reason
notions of
that all the Marxists control
horizontalism
the
or
institutions.
networks. There's been a whole series of these debates play out in different contexts. What's very interesting, I thought, was throughout my lifetime, at least, we've always been told the party's over, but the party seems to come back in different ways, metaphorically and literally. The problem there remains one. And so I'm not sure if we need to be too
A lot of
concerned,
socialist groups have been
be too
talking about the
fetishistic about
resurgence of the
whether
party
different
lately.
movements
A lot
today
of different people have.
use the term party to describe themselves and their organizational work, but more acknowledging the reality and recovering some of the true historical complexity of what the formation of political parties has meant for radical politics and the way they establish relations of endurance and some form of consistency over time. And here I engage with a number of different practical experiments, new types of parties that turned out to be not so new, but also various theoretical discussions around these notions, and suggest that some of the ideas Gramsci was trying to explore with his idea of the modern prince could be particularly useful for us to think about. The modern prince is one of those quite elusive terms that floats around discussions of Gramsci. It's interesting to look back and see that he doesn't actually use it all that often. And
this isn't true. Don't repeat James Lindsay's bullshit here.
But in that process, he's engaging quite deeply with a certain legacy of Machiavelli's thought and producing what I think is a very original reflection on the problems Machiavelli was posing, particularly in terms of thinking about the possibility of a radical politics as not involving, as it were, according to a very traditionalist reading of Machiavelli, the arrival of some type of new prince as an instance of new political knowledge, which was established its relationship to the political power of popular classes or other classes. But instead, Gramsci wants to suggest that maybe some of the more radical dimensions of that Machiavellian tradition is actually rethinking the relationship between political power and political knowledge. So that rather than a change of the object,
Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. Gramsci is the long march through the institution
that redefines them in terms of a power knowledge relation. And that I think is particularly important for trying to think through what I see as the very encouraging experiments in many radical political movements to get beyond some of the very traditionalist distinctions between instances of association and instances of organization. So to think through the possibility and the capacity of self-organization as an integral element of self-emancipatory politics.
Self-organization.
In the present. The conclusion I'd come to is say overall in the book, obviously, as I've indicated, there's quite a bit of theoretical reflection contained.
Because that's what they do, they self-organize.
Theoretical terms relating to theoretical text, but I've tried to keep in mind, as it were,
which means organizing outside of
to engage
the
with
institution.
Those theoretical discussions, some of the more prominent movements of recent years. And I indicated at the outset the relationship between those different movements and the learning experiences they've represented and how they've attempted to translate between each other. At the end of the process of trying to reflect in these ways, the conclusion I came to, in a sense, was as difficult as it may seem to believe at the outset, because pessimism is easy, and we should always be suspicious of things that are all too easy. There may actually be some cause for some rational optimism in the capacity of the unfolding of radical political movements around the globe and in the translation between them to found new types of radical political cultures. We've been living through a period of experimentation, of learning, of a transformation of leftist values. We've seen the emergence of new grammars and practices of radical politics. And if we see this in a longer generational perspective and see fundamentally the way in which structures of feeling and response have changed in leftist politics and forms of engagement, it seems to me that there is cause for some rational optimism, a capacity in these emergent radical political cultures to continue and take forward the struggle. And the book ultimately is intended as a contribution to continuing those discussions and strengthening them. I think I'll leave things there because I've probably already gone longer than I'd expected.
Thank you, Peter. So I just want to start by saying just how good I think this book is. It's precisely as compelling, insightful, and thought-provoking as you'd expect based upon Peter's previous work, including his seminal The Gramscian Moment. Staging a dialogue, as Peter just described, so I won't offer a full description of the book, but staging a dialogue between the central concepts, metaphors, and structures of feeling that have shaped contemporary movements and significant features of Gramsci's political theory. The book offers a masterful survey of a series of debates over the goals, nature, method, and organization of radical political agency, some of which Peter just referred to. There are an enormous number of insights here worth thinking about and thinking with. In my contribution to this discussion, I want to briefly do three things. First, highlight two discussions in the book that for me are particularly suggestive. Second, articulate something like what strikes me as the conceptual foundation of the book as a whole. We'll see if Peter agrees. And third, to raise some questions through and about that conceptual foundation in relation to the present conjuncture and the book's diagnosis of it. The first discussion I want to highlight compromises much of the second chapter, and here Peter already spoke about a good deal of this. But he argues there convincingly for the pressing relevance of state theory, in particular the work of Poulantzas, while also clearly delineating the extent, and this is the part I quite like, to which Poulantzas' strategic conception ends up in a trap largely of his own theoretical design. As Peter shows, Poulantzas' insistence on the pervasiveness of the state and on its unitary condensation of power relations across the social field seems to occlude any clear conception of where or how an alternative political power could emerge, leading Poulantzas in almost the same breath sometimes to both reject and to fall back upon a conception of a dual power strategy.
Really?
The account of these internal tensions and the reconstruction of Gramsci's notion of the integral state as a productive alternative to them is a novel and necessary propedeutic to state theory and political practice today,
Kelly.
And one of the best critical overviews of Poulantzas' thought that I've read in recent years. The second discussion I want to highlight is briefer in the book, but perhaps even more striking. In chapter 3, Peter argues that there has been a general misreading of the status of passive revolution in Gramsci's thought, even as its uses have multiplied. Passive revolution, that is not a positive conception of the form of bourgeois hegemony from the second half of the 19th century.
What is passive revolution?
That it can appear so, Peter argues, turns on the kind of domestication of the notion of hegemony into a euphemism for sovereignty that he referred to in his own remarks. If hegemony is rather a strategic hypothesis, as Peter argues, an attempted translation of the self-emancipatory practices of the Russian Revolution into new historical and geographical terrains, then the evolution of the concept of passive revolution in the prison notebooks emerges as the failure of Gramsci's attempt to translate that hypothesis of hegemony into a conception of the bourgeois project. Oriented by constitutively ununiversalizable founding principles like private property and a practical denial of the emancipatory ideals that it rhetorically proclaimed, that project is wholly incompatible with the emergence of practices of self-emancipation and self-direction, defining hegemony's method on Peter's account. The concept of passive revolution then, as Peter nicely puts it, emerged from stretching hegemony so far that it snapped. Bourgeois politics then has never been hegemonic, but rather subalternizing.
What do they mean when they say hegemony?
This notion of failed translations also functions as a description of a key aspect of the book's conceptual core, at least as
I don't know the answer to that.
That core lies, on my reading, in what Peter identifies as Gramsci's recovery of a critical potential in Hegel concerning the political constitution of the social, which itself is overdetermined by the social constitution of the political, in a dialectic without beginning or end. That dialectic plays out across the text of radical politics, as across the prison notebooks, in terms of the relationship between civil society and political society, and a set of cognates in relation to the cognate terms. Their identity distinction
So, like
turns,
taking
as
over the
for Hegel,
institutions?
on the relation between particularity and universality. But more importantly here, on what Peter argues is Gramsci's
So, like, who
innovative
controls the
usage of the
institutions? Is that
concepts
what that means?
to denote distinct, if integrally related, forms of socio-political
As in,
relationality.
the bourgeois has a
Political
hegemony?
society in this sense involves a synthesis of all relations of organization, regulation, and coordination in modern societies under grammars of identity, homogeneity, and representation, which retroactively impose order upon other associative forms of relationality. Civil society, as the substance of that retroaction, does not itself represent a terrain outside of the state, nor purely of the political. Rather, civil and political society are co-constituted as and through the defining dialectic of
Are you trying to get back at big tech or something?
wherein
What did
the
he do?
particularities of association are subsumed under an organization that claims to speak as their voice.
Stop telling him
while
to stop
remaining
giving me money,
structurally
Autumn. I like the
separated
money,
from it.
okay?
Associational practices, on the other hand, perpetually eclipse such ordered meanings, even as they are overdetermined by them. This conceptual framework is extremely generative across the book, articulating a framework for understanding subaltern self-direction as at once contained and neutralized by principles of order, and constantly driving towards a transformation of the relational nexus that composes that order.
In terms of like what they actually mean, because this is all over the place.
It underpins a reconception of the duality of dual power under the sign of these two forms of relationality, an account of the integral state as, quote, the mutual dependence of particularity and universality, which sustains associative relations as its basis, even as it repetitively works to render them non-political.
Well,
a notion of subalternization as the process of enclosure of rebellious energies within political society.
Everyone needs to forgive each other.
Hegemony as a mobilizing pedagogy of and for intersecting autonomous associational practices. And finally, a conception of the modern prince.
This is all I was asking
as,
for.
Quote, a merging of political knowledge and power, of organization and association,
as in the bourgeois have an hegemony,
distinction, and opens out onto new forms of what Gramsci called regulated society. The great strength of this book then lies precisely in its articulation of this generative relationality of Gramsci's core concepts and their organizing capacity in a learning process that contemporary movements have already initiated. That learning process finds its telos in Peter's account on the valorization of the organizational forms already at work in associative practices themselves, pointing towards processes of differentiated unification that necessarily always remain incomplete. It is then, as he says near the end of the book, the form and the practice of politicization in movements that will determine their capacity to grow. The book, while measured in its tone, outlines a markedly optimistic intellectual stance on the potentials for that growth. Still, these accounts of what radical politics might be able to become sit, in many ways knowingly, I think, in a relatively discordant relationship to the sober accounts of the present conjuncture also threaded through the book. The reconfigurations of state powers, their internalization of the imperatives of global accumulation, crises of social reproduction, the rising forces of far-right nationalism and xenophobia, as well as the punctual character of contemporary radical movements themselves, which seem to rise up only to vanish. And
social reproduction, that's abolished the family.
If political society is a failed translation of associative relations, it has been inordinately successful in the last 4 decades at keeping those relations from consolidating their own emergent configurations, even as crises and rebellious energies have intensified. Despite their limited and ambiguous victories, their punctual temporalities, their compromised collapses into passive revolutions, Peter tends to read the recent cycle of movements as, quote, accumulative, insofar as they have driven this kind of learning process he's interested in. I agree, but I also find myself wondering how to think about
this is going to get better when they get into the discussion, just so everyone knows.
Internal to movements,
right now they're doing
more or less on which the book focuses. How those might be situated in relation to what Peter in the Gramscian moment called Gramsci's philology of the relation of forces.
Philology.
An analysis of the historical factors that have composed
I haven't heard that word in a while.
and which it in turn composes. More specifically, what are the historical factors through which we can grasp the blockages and impasses that these movements have repeatedly confronted, and which have impeded not so much their learning processes, but their consolidation of enduring
Okay, guys,
formations
just
of
lean into it. This is
self-organized
socialist
power.
word salad. We've been through this before.
I'm
We
not,
trained
to
for
be
this.
clear, suggesting that we should return to the sort of left melancholia or the kinds of distant oracular diagnoses
All
of
you
the
do is ask
contemporary
them about
that Peter
hegemony.
rightly argues that the
That's
scope
not
and
fair.
energies of contemporary movements have tendentially supplanted. But I'm thinking here about, for example, what Rosa Luxemburg said about the aftermath of the truncated 1905 revolution, in which political defeat accumulated organizational strength on the economic side of its struggles. This is a brief quote from the mass strike. After every foaming wave of political action, a fructifying deposit remains behind from which 1,000 stalks of economic energy, of economic struggle,
it may have been on accident.
And conversely, the workers' condition of ceaseless economic struggle with the capitalists keeps their fighting energy alive in every political interval. It forms, so to speak, the permanent fresh reservoir of the strength of proletarian classes, from which the political fight ever renews its strength. Translated into a kind of conceptual foundation at work here, we might say something like the associational capacities of the Soviets, as in different ways of the German social democratic and communist parties, were grounded in part on their relationship to the specific organized relations of industrial workplaces, struggles against particular capitals with a partial autonomy from the universal apparatuses of the state, provided a relatively enduring, if contested, basis for mass experimental forms of associational organization, while providing a reservoir of strength for subsequent cycles of struggle, on Luxemburg's account. Today's intersectional movements, as Peter sometimes calls them, tend to lack such clearly defined infrastructures and reservoirs, a lack that can appear as both their merit and their weakness. They are at once more general and more atomized, crisscrossing individualizing debt and asset relations, precaritized labor conditions, state-administered and outsourced provision and extraction, ecological devastation, privatized forms of unwaged gendered labor, differential exposures to state violence, and so on. Through these struggles, they tend to be driven more immediately to reckon with the
Cobra
forces
Commander
of
Red
capital as a
May
whole,
has literally done
states,
sessions
and so
about abolish the
seem more
family.
subject to the demobilizing effects
Tell
of
Cobra Commander
defeat.
to go back to
The modern
Red May 2020 and watch
Prince,
the
as
session
Peter
with
develops
Sophie
it in his
Lewis
book,
about abolish the
does
family,
seem in
or
one way
refer
a
to
key
Sophie's
part of an
other
answer to this problem,
presentations for
understood
Red
as
May.
both an organizing
Emmy
as both
O'Brien has
organizing an
presented for Red
ongoing
May.
multi-scale deconstruction of existing political society, or rupturing the terms of order, and refusing the production of a new order in favor of the multiplication of diverse practices and the exchange and interchange enabled by their proximity and common relations of world building. But the formation of this new kind of party
and Emmy
would
O'Brien
seem
have
itself to
presented
rest
for
on
Red May
identifying where and on what basis within the existing
multiple
orders
times.
of political society, diverse associational practices could establish reservoirs of strength on which the creation, endurance, and expansion of such a party could itself be founded. This then, at least this is what I'm proposing, perhaps defines a kind of fifth set of questions that the learning process of movements, as well as that of this book,
Sophie Lewis.
Pose. What are the specific impasses that have kept associated
Not everyone knows who Sophie
with all their pedagogical potentials from forming into ascending sequences of struggle? In what concrete sites, under what material conditions could defeats become fructifying today, even in the face of the intensifying resistance of states to any eruption of a non-state identity in the everyday life?
Thank you, Josh Randall Disavows. I appreciate you.
I'd be interested to hear Peter's and all of your thoughts.
You should still forgive big tech, though.
Thanks.
Be friends again. Be cool.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, thanks to Red May for bringing us together on this panel. I'm very happy to be in conversation with Michael, Max, and of course, Peter, who's an old friend and comrade and interlocutor. And he's written a really wonderful book, which should be read widely, discussed widely, and I hope our conversation can contribute to that. That's the hope anyway. So what I want to do is to begin with what I think is the big...
Oh, shit. I accidentally just reloaded. Sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I just meant to click over to it to see the chat.
Maybe work my way into some of the more theoretical fine points with which Peter makes that intervention. And I think the biggest intervention is that this book opens a theoretical space that is well beyond left liberalism, from which to discuss the problems and potentialities of radical politics today, such that, you know, what appears to be, from a kind of conventional mainstream political paradigm, what appears to be
You're welcome.
on the left, such as, you know, the kind of melancholic current, the Weberianism, the Rawlsianism, these all come to appear when you read Peter's work as sort of like the last few exits on the highway that Peter constructs for us. And this highway unapologetically takes us into the heart of revolutionary politics. And I really appreciate that, because
thank you, Josh Randall, for your super
we can
chats.
finally begin to discuss sort of the
you
real
can absolutely
issues
buy
at
my
stake.
love.
And in so doing,
we can have a pretend
Peter
internet
takes us
relationship just like me and Big Tech did.
back to Machiavelli's fundamental insight that there are really those who govern.
In fact, you and
those
Big
who
Tech
are
should
governed.
fight over me, I think.
For
I think that'd be
Machiavelli,
pretty
of
great.
course, this is more of a statement of fact, as Peter puts it in the book, a primordial fact of politics, whose conflictuality can only be institutionalized in better or worse forms. For Gramsci, and I think for Peter, this is not just a fact, it's more an opportunity for movement, for not necessarily finding who will be the right leaders. To the contrary, a continuous struggle for self-emancipation that rethinks what it means to govern, what it means to be governed, and that relationality itself. So I think this is a really important starting point in my understanding and reconstruction of the book, which I also, I mean, it's a Machiavellian starting point, but I think this is not the only Machiavellian aspect of the text. In the best possible way, I think there's an appreciation in the book for politics, in its complexity, in its potentialities, in its possibilities for founding what Machiavelli calls the new modes and orders. And there is a faith that comes across, a faith in the self, in the capacity for the masses to organize themselves.
It's better off. He doesn't need to know.
Capacity of the masses to found new modes and orders, not out of thin air, not from some beyond a kind of miracle that will come and reorganize everything, but already out of what exists, from what is already latent, what is already there, but through an ongoing practice of reordering what exists. And I think that is also a very realistic and yet faithful approach to politics, faithful in the sense of its possibilities. And I think in that sense too, there's a deep Machiavellian current that I think has to be recognized. So the book is really a rethinking of Gramsci for the left, and a rethinking of the left from the perspective of Gramsci. And those of us who've spent some time with Gramsci know how notoriously difficult it is to read Gramsci. The prison notebooks, for various reasons of the ways in which they were written, the location, the carcerality, all of these are mentioned in the book.
these are very difficult texts, and Peter is a great guide into Gramsci's thought. I mean, already with his first book,
Has
which was a
anyone read those
masterful
books?
exposition of Gramsci's thought, he had led us into Gramsci, but what he's doing here is much beyond that, because to my understanding,
he's Midwestern Mark.
what Peter's trying to do is to develop an alternative interpretation of Gramsci. You know, there are very famously established takes on Gramsci that we're all familiar with: the subaltern school, the cultural studies branch, inspired by Stuart Hall, and the post-Marxist branch, let's say, inspired by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe's famous work. And for each, Gramsci is different. They each take Gramsci up in a different way. And, you know, if I were to sharpen the differences, maybe doing some violence in the meantime, I would say maybe for the subaltern school, you know, the emphasis is much more on the uneven development of modernity and the unevenness of incorporation of the masses, especially of the peasantry. So Gramsci emerges more as a thinker of the South. You know, for the cultural studies branch, it is much more how hegemony is constructed in the domains of ideology and culture. And of course, for Laclau and Mouffe, it's how hegemony becomes a logic of articulation among different social forces that are neither pre-constituted nor have a privileged place in the struggle.
I hate academic socialists. This sucks. Start the discussion.
So as I said, what I think Peter is trying to do is to carve out a different way of reading and interpreting Gramsci.
I mean,
surely in elbow contact with
I'm not
these
open to it.
already very well-established schools.
You keep sending in those super chats, we'll see what happens.
Taking up Gramsci as a strategic thinker.
Thank you, Josh Randall.
Most of all, as a strategic thinker of politics, whose contributions theoretically,
I still think you're just giving me all your money because you're mad at big tech,
cannot simply be understood through
and I hope you're not doing that.
Exegesis, but must really be seen as evolving responses to the demands of his own conjuncture. And you know, for obvious reasons, this conjuncture was marked by the failure of revolutions in the West and the rise of fascism.
Capitalism.
And Peter shows us how Gramsci was able to use the different meanings of, and the contested meanings of hegemony that he encountered in the early Soviet context, and how he kind of reworked them in an evolving way to address what he understood to be his conjuncture, the problems of the emergence of a kind of absolutism in the West in the wake of failed revolutions. So Peter doesn't try to resolve the inconsistencies of formulation that one might sometimes find in Gramsci, or to say, oh, this one has to be taken as the basis of the others. Instead, I think what he does is to argue for a much more nuanced sense in which Gramsci himself was experimenting with the concepts that he was using and developing those in an evolving and interactive way with his own conjuncture as tools of critique that, you know, go back and forth with the reality and complexity of politics, back into theory, kind of shuttling, let's say, between the world of praxis and the world of philosophy.
Fucking hate that word, praxis.
So, in that sense, Peter's reading of Gramsci as this much more, like putting the emphasis much more on the strategic dimension of Gramsci as a thinker of his own conjuncture, gives us a new conceptual arsenal, or reinterprets some of the familiar and not so familiar Gramscian concepts in a way that offers almost a configuration of a toolbox, one could say, that could aid us in our diagnoses of the present, in the ways in which we approach struggle, and the organizational forms, etc. All of the issues that Peter outlines. And here, in the interest of time, I want to highlight the book is teeming with a lot of rich interpretations, and I cannot do justice to all of them, but maybe I just want to highlight a few that I think are really standing out in terms of their importance. One, of course, is hegemony, but hegemony in the way that Peter is reworking in this strategic conception, where it emerges more as a method than as an end state or a set of institutions.
No one knows what the word praxis means, though. The only people who know are these people. I refuse to use it. I hate
as a method of self-emancipatory politics is really important, because what Peter is doing
normal
is
people do not understand that word.
Sever or problematize its relationships with the conception of passive revolution, with which it's come to be paired as a result of the influential interpretations that I've alluded to.
Not even socialist activists use the word praxis.
And for Peter, these interpretations have the perhaps unintended consequence of taming the potentiality of the concept of hegemony itself.
But not even the pro-Palestine activists use the word praxis.
To a kind of
they don't even use that
imaginary word. And a sovereigntist politics that I think Peter wants to kind of disentangle.
No, it's fine that
we
all know what it means. I'm just saying,
not in the way of ignoring the
use
state,
the word.
but in the way
not
of
even
letting our imaginations
well, this is another reason I don't like it,
by the
because
sovereign
James tried to make it a thing, and no one
So
knows
in this
what it
regard,
means.
he suggests, for example, that hegemony and passive revolution have to be thought together, and in a what I think in a counterintuitive way, that passive revolution is a failure of hegemony, that it's a deceptive revolution, that it is.
I didn't say no.
The appearance of hegemony without
actually me. Is that too much to ask?
Being a hegemony. And this is a counterintuitive position, because
I'll probably be like, you can have her.
Before engaging with Peter's work, I had thought that passive revolution, for example, is more of a designation of the success of hegemony, that it is a kind of revolution that takes place in the realm of, let's say, the hearts and minds or the civil society, where people's values and opinions change without necessitating a kind of formal revolution. And what Peter is doing is kind of like turning that upside down and showing
no real
that passive
people use the word
actually exposes the fragility of the hegemony of bourgeois modernity.
We only use words that real people know here.
Then there is the idea of the integral state, which is also a very, very important conceptual contribution that Peter is making by reworking Gramsci strategically. And here, what he's doing, again, is kind of counterintuitive, because he works through the Poulantzasian critique of Gramsci, which kind of posits, from Poulantzas's perspective, Gramsci and Poulantzas kind of at odds with one another in terms of what Poulantzas wants to do. And what Peter does is to show actually that there's a great convergence in the ways in which both of these thinkers were conceptualizing the state, not just as an apparatus, not as a set of institutions, but as a kind of relation that
the state is a relation,
condensation of the struggle between social forces. And so this is, again, a really important contribution, I think, both theoretically in terms of showing certain unexpected convergences on the left in terms of state theory, and this is something that Michael also already alluded to, but also strategically in terms of deciding how to engage a politics in relation to the state. There's the duality of dual power, the idea of a regulated society that Gramsci proposes. And very interesting to me is the dialectic of subalternization and desubalternization. And here again, Peter is doing something counterintuitive with what has come to be understood as the figure of the subaltern, you know, with the famous essay.
Heidi, you and I were like the main competitors for that Patrick Bet-David thing. I don't mind if you get it.
Peter
I'd be happy
that
for
the
you.
subaltern is not a figure of destitution. It is not a position of voicelessness, of non-representability. Instead, there is a trafficking between the state's attempt at continuously trying to domesticate the rebelliousness of the masses, and in turn, the masses' continuous attempt to limit the state's attempt at domesticating them. So this struggle is really what goes on at the heart of what Peter is rethinking as hegemony. And there's a lot more to be said about that. But in the interest of time, I just want to move toward a brief conclusion. While Peter is providing this toolkit for us, this arsenal, this conceptual arsenal for us, I thought about what his method of inquiry is, what his method of working is, because he uses the metaphor of translation in introducing the book to represent the work that he's doing. But he also says that it's not a translation of Gramsci into the present, but a translation of Gramsci by the present. And I thought that was a really important moment in the book, because it suggests a sensibility of a reading of Gramsci that's inspired by the history of the present, by the concerns of the present, by our own conjuncture. So it's a very Gramscian reading of Gramsci. But it also reminded me or made me think that the metaphor of translation is somehow not entirely adequate to capture what he's doing, because what he was doing reminded me of Machiavelli's famous metaphor of the landscape painter, where, you know, as all of you would probably know, you have to stand in the valley to be able to paint the mountain, and you have to stand in the mountain to be able to paint the valley, of course, signifying the two natures of the governor, those who govern and those who are governed. And in a sense, Peter is a landscape painter. He is painting for us the landscape, but this time this is the landscape of the left, because he positions Gramsci and then he positions all the prominent thinkers of the left on the left, Negri and Hart and Badiou and Laclau, Althusser, Poulantzas, Benjamin. I mean, so many figures enter into conversation with Gramsci, and he really sort of puts them as different coordinates or different elements.
Lean into it. They're going to say something useful eventually.
From the point of view, however,
this is hard,
not
though. This
of
is
the valley nor of the mountain.
Everyone here is
a
champion.
Always the aspiration of the self-emancipation of the masses. So, in that sense, it's a really, really important work. I have some questions to raise, but maybe in the interest of time, I'll save them for discussion, and I'll just turn my spot over to Max.
The discussion is where we're going to get our most fruitful stuff, because they're reading prepared remarks right now.
So thank you for inviting me.
Oh no.
It's a great conversation.
He sounds European. Oh God. Everyone go get a drink or something.
I want to start with a very short autobiographical note. I met Peter in Padua in the 90s, and when I was professor.
No, there are some red mainstreams that are really good.
And Peter brought to our conversation
some of them
in Padua
are really good. The queer Marxism ones
fresh
are good.
international global air, I would say, especially
Yep.
his reading of Gramsci in a global or mainly Anglo-Saxophone context that was really refreshing. But what is important is that the 90s were also a time of deep pessimism. And I remember our conversations, some of our conversations in Padua was about how it's possible to turn this pessimism into political optimism. And we agree that this is not something that a theory can do. So I see this book as a part of that conversation, how to turn pessimism into political optimism. And but to understand the meaning of this pessimism means
Yes.
to understand the background that generated that pessimism. So in a few words, the 90s, or let's start from the 80s, but
Oh
really
God!
in 1 minute.
Okay, the 80s.
In the 80s,
fine.
We had Reagan, Thatcher, and Gramsci in Italy, but that was the attack against unions, the air traffic controllers in the US, the miners in England.
Remember,
and the attack
socialist
against
control of the unions.
The Scala Mobile, that was a kind of a mechanism that adjusted wages on the basis of inflation. But that attack against this mechanism, from the perspective of Gramsci in Italy in the 80s, was an attack against the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, and the unions.
The Communist
Then
Party and the unions.
1989 arrived, and that was the collapse of the
all unions
Soviet
are socialists.
That was not a real shock. I think part of
Yo, give into it, everyday therapist. I hope you're doing well.
This group of intellectuals and activists that Peter met in Padua, we were on the same kind of anti-Stalinist side, so we were not particularly.
Thank you, Josh Randall Disavows. I appreciate you.
We understood
Everyone should take after Josh Randall's good example.
1989 was a turning point because it was possible to disagree.
He didn't do anything wrong.
And to denounce Soviet Union and that kind of a socialism or existing socialism in those countries, but at the same time, that possibility, that existence showed that it was possible to do the same thing better, to do something similar but better. So that possibility imploded with the implosion of that experiment. Because one can say, and I will say, especially now after many years, that that was an experiment. I will say a failed experiment, but it was an experiment. And at the same time, the 90s arrived, and that was the decade of implosion of parties and big political organizations and unions. That was the time of intensified atomization, what people called neoliberalism. There was the time of the absence, the loss of any real political compass. Political activists were disoriented. There was also the time of proliferation. Now I'm going to list some of the things that Peter is discussing in the first pages of the book. It was the time of a proliferation and multiplication of philosophies of the post. At that time, everything was a postmodernism, post-Fordism, post-history,
post-Fordism,
and so on.
Human centipede, Fordism.
And it was also not immediately in the 90s, but after that, maybe this is a kind of a continuation
it's like
of
being
that
in Brave
pessimism.
New World every time they say it.
It was the dissemination of what Peter called a Weberian tone. A Weberian tone among intellectuals, a kind of a aristocratic standpoint from which people could judge and understand and analyze the world. But then finally, a turning point, and this is what the book is about. A turning point in Peter's world is characterized by, I'm reading from page 2, is the very beginning of the book. So Peter writes, sometimes these radical emancipatory movements have been punctual, sometimes ephemeral in appearance, and sometimes subterranean in effect. But their stubbornly persistent emergence and re-emergence signifies the development of a new forms of a conflict and struggle. So the book is about this new form, is how it's possible to make sense of a contemporary movement of emancipation and self-emancipation. Is basically what the theory was not able to do, to turn pessimism into optimism, is something that practice can do. And I think in Peter's book there is an attempt to.
I'm falling asleep, but we're going to get to the discussion soon. Everyone, hang in.
Political practice seriously.
Sometimes this is just what we have to sit through. I'm sorry.
What the theory should be. According to Peter, these new movements are characterized by experimentation, risk, and learning processes. And what it's doing in the book is it tries to investigate them in conversation with Gramsci on the one hand, and by going back to Aristotle's etiology on the other hand.
What does Aristotle have
to
do with
four
Gramsci?
Causes. Peter said that in the introduction to the final, material, efficient, and formal cause. So my understanding of this move is that Peter, in order to understand radical politics today, Peter tries to explore this movement.
The proletariat is rising up against the presentation.
To a sort of a ground
the proletarian
zero,
worker is rising up.
A new starting point. So there is a kind of a need for new categories in order to see and understand the coherence that permeates today's movements. On the one hand, there is a Gramsci who writes from the prison, and he writes from the defeat of the Communist Party, the defeat of communist movements, from a time in which parties and unions were crushed by fascism.
Capitalism.
Gramsci is an interlocutor that helped us to understand politics and political historical processes.
Do socialists acknowledge the long march through the institutions?
Without,
like, do they admit that they did that?
Presence of these gigantic parties, but in a kind of a new conjuncture in which it's possible to make a different kind of intervention. This is Gramsci. On the other hand, Aristotle is the long tradition. Is basically 2,500 years of a tradition. And Aristotle teaches us
Thank you,
how to make sense to the world in which we live. Why things are as they are. And I think this is Peter's attempt to going back to Aristotle and to combine the four causes.
Isn't that funny?
In order to provide,
I mean, maybe Bob's question will get us some good information. Like, you guys realize Gramsci's march was successful, right?
This is what Peter is doing. So why the current movements are what they are and as they are. And as I said, to answer this question, Peter wants to reset the system.
If we can get them to answer that question, Badass, that'll make this whole thing worthwhile.
Big organizations, but this is just a starting point. Instead of complaining because they don't have a party or they need organization, Peter takes
maybe ask in a more academic way, Rottweiler. Not that Bot's question isn't great, but maybe ask it in a more flowery, translated into socialist for us.
And I think the question that underlies the entire book is, on the one hand, is how we understand is a movement. On the other hand, is how can something new emerge?
Bot's gonna get banned.
And Peter is totally aware that the new cannot emerge out of the blue. It's not a result of a creatio ex nihilo. It doesn't emerge from nothing. It is not a total negation of the current state of affairs. It is instead a reconfiguration of existing dimensions and materials in a new forms. It is a prefiguration of a political, of a different political social order. And I think this is where the category of hegemony emerged. And hegemony works in this book in terms of prefigurative struggles for the emerging of something new. Is related to experiments and risk, as I said before. And then I think Gramsci becomes crucial. There is a citation from Gramsci in the book. I want to read it. This is Gramsci. I quote: "Hegemony is related to something that sprang from all the pores of the society, which had to be transformed." In Peter's reading, this is related to the primacy.
I'm going to need to watch something so mind-numbingly dumb later to counterbalance all this out.
And now I have a
few
questions for Peter. If I put together Gramsci's statement about hegemony and how Peter works.
Very well worded.
Idea of hegemony. So, if hegemony is this prefiguration and the emergence of something new, something that is disruptive of the existing order, something that is related to the possibility of reordering without an end.
Disruptive to the order.
Again, I'm citing Peter.
A reordering without an
end. My question is:
the perpetual revolution, the reordering without an
something
end.
that can be understood as a form of a political excess, something that is that can be related to politics when politics exceeds the political form. If this is the case, I think we need to discuss what kind of institutions can emerge in what Peter calls prefigurative politics. What is the form that anticipates a new order, an order that is always open to transformation and to question itself? A second question that is related to the first one is that the hegemony is a real one when it can address and resolve.
We'll pass that on.
The problem of the present conjuncture.
We're watching Shaun of the Dead this week.
But the problem of the present conjuncture in Gramsci and today are also problems of uneven development, I would say, around the world, in the global world, and within single countries, single states. is an uneven development that can be addressed in terms of temporal anachronism, in terms of the presence of out of sync strata of the population. And fascism was a gigantic attempt, successful attempt, to synchronize out of sync strata of the population. That was also the problem, was not only the problem of Gramsci, but also of Ernst Bloch in Germany when he was discussing National Socialism. And now the point is that
Nazis drink.
If fascism is a good tool to synchronize out of sync strata, do we have a different form of a synchronization? Is a hegemony related to a different form of a synchronization that doesn't use the huge amount of violence and power that has been usually used by fascist movements? But how is possible to synchronize these different strata and layers, especially when people felt left behind and they have a kind of a resentment and hatred against other part of the population? I think this is something that is going on in Europe, in the US, and in other countries. We have entire societies which are deeply divided. And that goes to my last question. So this division and tension between strata of the population gives rise to new authoritarian movements and right-wing movements. These movements can be defined as a kind of a wrong answer to the right question. There is a question that has to be answered. And they have a form of hegemony. Again, my problem is, and they also express a kind of an excess in relation to the political form. They question the political form. They question a state that has become a labyrinth of laws and institutions, a labyrinth and a Kafkaesque castle, and they are questioning the same thing that the left question or should question. And they have a form of hegemony. Again, the question is, how is possible to build, to form, to construct a form of hegemony that is a possible dialogue with this strata and part of the population that has been left behind? I think in a certain way, this is what put ourselves in dialogue with the thinkers of the beginning of the 20th century, like Gramsci or Ernst Bloch, thinkers who were addressing similar questions and similar political issues. So how authoritarianism or fascism can emerge, and how it's possible to work with that in terms not just of a counterposition, but to use the word that we are discussing, in terms of hegemony. And that's it.
Oh, thank God. Discussion. Thank
Thank
God.
you, Max.
Oh,
Thank you all
everyone
for those
wake up.
excellent
We
contributions.
suffered. We made it.
Peter, do you maybe want to
Discussion.
respond, and then we can just take a few more minutes for any discussion, maybe especially for Banu to follow up with her questions, perhaps?
Sure. Well, thank you very much to all of you for those incredibly stimulating comments. And I'm certainly not going to be able to do justice to the many important points you've raised.
I almost fell asleep.
Tonight, but
I'm
I just maybe want to pick up on a few points
more
raised
entertaining.
by
I can't
each of
control
you
that.
to think through, because I think you sort of come to some of the central political and theoretical problems I was trying to grapple with here. And the comments you've made indicate I think we can make some real progress to explore those further. I think, Michael, in your comments, it really comes down to one of the fundamental issues I was grappling with. Where are the infrastructures today, and where are the bases for building durable oppositional cultures that can support radical political agendas? And it's very easy
They don't know they have the
looking around
institutions.
to
They don't
immediately feel
know.
quite
He
disheartened.
just said, where are the
Particularly if you're
institutions?
coming at this
They
with
don't
maybe
know.
some personal memories or maybe some historically acquired memories of the vibrancy of previous leftist cultures and the infrastructures that they were able to draw upon. And it's obviously an issue. The forms of community organization sustained many radical campaigns in the past, completely smashed up, often through direct forms of state intervention. We think about the Black Panther Party and movements around it, and what went on there. We think about the smashing up of trade unions on a global scale, not just in terms of the sort of economic bargaining units at the official level, but what the trade union movement meant more widely in the lives of different communities and the support networks that were available and all of the associated social and cultural activities that went with it. So there are obviously clear reasons where we can feel quite pessimistic and see the weakness of
they really
those
don't know
infrastructures in contemporary politics as one of the reasons why you get this recurrent cycle of movements of rebellion
This
coming
is like
up,
James Lindsay
but
not
then
realizing that queer
not being able
theory
to
is about
stay
the
there
gender
and
binary and the
collapsing back
nuclear
down,
family and
seemingly
capitalism.
disappearing
It's the same thing. It's like,
into the
how can you
soil.
not know?
But if we shift slightly and try and think about not what we're lacking, but what might be there, you see some real durability and consistency emerging. And the key example I would give here is maybe our infrastructures have shifted slightly in some directions, and there's a rediscovery of we don't need to go too far, but say if we want spiritual infrastructures that weren't available to us in the past. And I just invite this thought experiment.
Spiritual
If you remember back to the sort
infrastructures.
of leftist cultures that were circulating around when many of us were much younger, you can imagine a scene in which lots of themes of feminist discussions, issues of social reproduction were present in cultures of the radical left, but certainly weren't enjoying a position in which they were setting agendas and driving debates and were taken in as a part of the sort of everyday common sense, even of supposedly leftist radical organizing. Certainly the left-wing cultures with which I engaged in my youth could be characterized as quite heavily patriarchal in all sorts of ways. And I don't think that's necessarily shifted entirely. We're still
They're saying the
dealing with
influence of the
legacies
abolish the family
of those
people has
practices,
grown.
even and especially on the left. But if we take back and look at where things were, and we look at the consistency of radical political cultures in different ways today, you can see certainly those sorts of questions and debates and priorities are much more prominent and much more central. The scandals much more immediately present, and the struggles around those within and between movements are much stronger. And that would seem to me an important development in the infrastructures of the left in terms of its priorities and overall all cultures. So I'm not trying to overblow this or go searching for the sort of the rose in the thorny cross of the present, but there are resources of hope that are available to us.
No, but what we're saying, they really don't know. They have no idea. This is not acting. They don't know.
When they're expanded
Remember,
consistently. And I think we have seen
they're just talking to each other
those
here.
types of dimensions emerging, in particular when you look at the way movements around
that's okay. I actually like that you asked that,
the various forms in which certain liberal discussions tried to mirror that around Me Too movements in different ways evolved, but then also the way that then transferred over into many of the discussions around Black Lives Matters and the reconnection with traditions of Black feminist activists, and the way today you're seeing that play out in all sorts of really creative ways in terms of Palestine solidarity movements. So there are instances here of a rebuilding of areas and resources of hope that maybe they haven't clicked at this point in time. Maybe they're not as strong or as durable as we would like, but the direction of travel seems one. There's a wave there, and if we can find some way to surf it, it's possible that it might land us on an interesting sort of beach. The more fundamental issues underneath that, more generally, though, obviously remain. It's precisely how we manage to move from the stage we've been in of 30 years of struggles emerging, falling back of different types. And that's the $1 million question I think we're all grappling with, of how we manage to get them to all come together in some forms of consistency.
They really don't know.
There have been attempts, some very significant attempts, as usual.
Can
because
someone
the
ask
left
what
have
does
pretty
success
much
look
all
like?
ended in defeat,
Like, how will you know
about which
when
we, of course, all
you've
get
achieved
defeated
your
and
aims?
depressed for a time, but they keep coming back in different instances. So yes, the whole process of radicalization around Lula's first government in Brazil ended in a train wreck, of which we're aware. Second edition looks similar. Dynamics maybe not quite so exciting. The situation around
They
Sanders'
don't like
election
Lula.
campaigns
That's
in
funny.
the US, similar dynamic. Corbyn's leadership in the Labour Party, Syriza in Greece, early moments of Podemos in Spain, and you could multiply this out on all sorts of contexts around the globe. But the fact that they're happening and those regroupment efforts are occurring and those experiments are happening is already transforming the expectations of a generation and the sort of legacies that are being passing down. And that, I think, is the material we have to work with, acknowledging all the limitations and the blockages we still have, but looking for ways to build upon what can seem incredibly modest and small successes, but nevertheless the cards we've been given to play with. Banu really correctly discerned sort of a Machiavellian dimension underneath everything, and I was left there, chewing on my fingers, wondering why the wonderful image Machiavelli gives us around the landscape painter hadn't figured more prominently in the book to frame it in a way. But there's a dimension here, I think, that line running throughout traditions of particularly Italian radical thinking from Machiavelli to Gramsci and beyond that was very important for me in thinking through these problems. But, obviously not the sort of Machiavelli we often get fed up in the fairly domesticated forms, but that more radical Machiavelli that poses all those fundamental problems of what's actually happening in politics. And my reading here is heavily influenced by the approach Gramsci will adopt in a particular phase, a very radical intervention into all the debates going on in Italy in the 20s and the 30s around the nature of the prince as a text and the concept, and particularly these notions of the relations between political knowledge and political power and how they can be reconfigured given that primordial fact of politics. And each time I come back to those texts and look again, it's almost like Machiavelli's always there waiting for you with something else to offer to think about those sorts of problems, because they are, in a sense, the fundamental problems you're going to encounter in any particular political sequence, or you're trying to think politically in that distinctive Machiavellian way. You also highlight, I think, importantly, I discuss a whole range of sort of established interpretations of Gramsci in the book, and I'm not so much concerned to say that they're wrong interpretations, perfectly legitimate interpretations.
Trendlin.
They've enjoyed a wide readership, and they've done lots of really important
do you know the
things.
4
They've
goals of
produced
the
important
long
effects and opened up all sorts of different ranges of thinking. And I would say that
God damn, I told you guys not to ship post.
About interpretations of Gramsci with which I might have various philological, scholastic reasons to disagree quite strongly.
What happens when they bore us for an hour and a half?
The work of Leclau and Mouffe seems to me in many respects not particularly closely founded in a certain type of reading of Gramsci's text, but nevertheless they managed to do quite creative and interesting things to elaborate political categories in different directions. And that, I think, is the element also why Gramsci can be so interesting to think into the relation to the present, that in a way the various conflicting histories of interpretation of Gramsci and the emphases different areas have brought to his concepts makes his thought and the debates around it something like a type of world into which you can enter
but if
and
we
see a whole
ship
range
post, they're
of
less likely to answer questions, and we
so
want
there's
them
an
to answer
productivity
questions.
In that relation, not just in relation to Gramsci's texts themselves and what's right or wrong or what he really meant to say or the various other ways we can approach them, but also in terms of the history of those conflicting interpretations. And a very good example there is the way in which subaltern studies in different ways took up and developed a really central, and I think, as I increasingly reflect upon it, fundamental theme in Gramsci's thinking around notions of subalternity.
I mean, they might
Did
still
so
answer.
in different ways from
we don't know
to Spivak to Chatterjee and beyond in ways with which
they've
I may
taken our
disagree,
questions
but
before.
we're incredibly productive and creative in setting the terms of debate. And indeed, precisely because of their emphasis on concepts that other readers had previously missed in Gramsci or hadn't done much with, have enabled people to go back and reconsider those and reconfigure relations, and thereby hopefully try and make Gramsci more politically useful for the present. So there's an important dimension in the appeal of Gramsci's thinking there as well that recommends him as some sort of a distinctive interlocutor for contemporary movements, perhaps more so than other equally significant
Good
historical
question,
figures from the
Rottweiler.
history of radical political thought. And Max posed a number of important questions. In a lot of ways, these goes back to those debates Max and I had when we were very much younger, and discussions around themes. And I'll reveal a sort of confessional moment here, that when I first met Max, he was certainly a very distinguished professor already in the Italian debate and discussion, but actually was spending a lot of his time engaged in very intense political work around support for migrant workers and the anti-racist struggle in Italy. And I was really struck distinctively about how those concerns flowed across in Max's thinking and work quite organically, even when you couldn't necessarily see that from the sort of published texts that were being produced. And I think in many ways it's those political ultimate reasons in a way that come through in the questions Max has posed this evening. There's the important issue of trying to think through the kinds of institutions necessary to help hegemony endure as a process of political excess and exceeding political forms. And there, I think the important question is the types of political forms, because one of the tricks or the games, as it were, is it's very easy, even and especially for radical politics, to be lured into an acceptance of the forms and conceptuality of modern politics as we receive it. Various representative modes of politics, or as I prefer to call it, the absenting of popular political power and participation, are almost ingrained in the very structure of the way we think of politics as a terrain dominated by certain types of leaders as positions of power or authority or potential command, and the way they're transmitted to various movements conceived as foot soldiers. There, I think, trying to think through this more strategic dimension of hegemony, or a strategic use of ideas of hegemony in Gramsci, I think can be very useful for us to think about, because there are, not everywhere in Gramsci's prison notebooks, but important moments, real reflections on the way that hegemony has a potential to be its own deconstructive critique, in a way that it's constantly seeking to put itself into question.
Remember, this is about a book that they teach. So just because there aren't that many people watching this particular thing doesn't mean these people are influential, or these people aren't
that's
influential.
An important dimension, I think, also to think around the problem.
They're teaching this stuff in the universities
that you raised, and I think you're correct. Lots of ways that we can characterize fascism is a massive machine of discordant synchronization, and we can speak here about the 30s just as much as we can speak about the various fascist movements underway today, remembering that of course there are now governments across Europe claiming quite explicit about the fact of their affiliations back to the fascism of the 1930s, not to speak of the various other movements around the globe as well today. And the real key here, I think, is to think of hegemony not as an alternative process of synchronization, but perhaps as an excess of desynchronization, or an attempt to push processes of desynchronization and find different modes of the coordination and communication between different temporalities. At the origin, a lot of important discussions around temporalities. When we go back to Herder's conception, we have an idea that everything will have its own temporal measure. And it is a question then of trying to synchronize those according to some supposedly natural time that coordinates all of them. And I think it's along those lines of understanding the temporalities implicit in particular movements, their own nourishment, their own growth, their own decline, their own forms of inheritance and legacy, rather than attempting to look for that unifying instance that would somehow stabilize them, but to work with the dynamic between them. But I think a hegemonic approach to politics gives us some really interesting resources in our current moment. And that brings me to the final really important point you raised about authoritarian movements, particularly in the present, and the sort of almost hegemonic forms it would seem.
What authoritarian movements?
In some areas. And I wonder here, are we dealing with a case of hegemony as a sort of excess of the given political forms, or instead the almost surreptitious affirmation of given political forms? And I'll end on this note. The whole movement surrounding the Trumpism, as it were, the broader movement in North America, can be characterized in a whole bunch of different ways. Left liberal commentary is obsessed with decrying the terrors of Trumpian populism and so forth. But I wonder, in the bigger
populism is
fascism. Is
fascism.
that necessarily the case, or is the type of Trumpist move instead, precisely in its most populist dimensions, one of the most potent forms of affirmation of established representative conceptions of political order? Because we all know how the story's been going and how it ends. It ends with the consolidation and affirmation of all of the principles of private property, of hierarchy, of patriarchy, everything associated with it. All of this is
so
the
capitalism.
reason why, despite all the horror and outrage that's presented,
that was a good clip.
Ultimately, the Republican establishment has been more than willing for quite some time now to surf the Trumpian wave. I think because rather than seeing this as an excess of its own populist forms,
the Trumpian wave is defined as private property, patriarchy, and what was the other? Hierarchy.
Movement as a way of reinforcing,
which all mean capitalism
itself. And that, I think, is one of the big challenges then of precisely how there are interventions into communities that have felt the lures of this type of politics, and the attempt to re-establish those sorts of infrastructures of dissent and of genuinely radical politics that can pose a credible narrative.
No, authoritarian means anything that's not socialist. They do not consider,
even when it presents itself
they
as
don't consider Democrats to be socialist.
Disorder.
This is not right versus left. Authoritarian is anything that is not socialist.
I know time, the clock's ticking.
Yeah, I think we may have to leave it there.
No,
but thank you all for the
questions.
Excellent discussion. Thank you especially Peter for the excellent book. And thank you to Red May for organizing this talk. I think Philip may be jumping back in. Is that correct?
Ask Philip the question about the wig.
Yes, here I am, having jumped and leapt in.
Philip will donate
Peter
money to him if he tells us about the wig.
Max,
Philip, we'll donate
always,
$100 to Red May if you tell us about the wig.
Blow by blow, and could follow it out another hour or so.
Tell Philip we'll donate $100 if he tells us about the wig. I really will do it. No
the tech
joke.
Counter behind us. I just want to pitch for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come on YouTube and you can see Scott Aquano and Steve Meyer talk about their book of the Fall and Rise of American Finance from Bursa. So see you then, I hope, and goodbye.
No, Philip, we want to give you money, Philip.
Thank you.
Oh, man. Oh, look, I'm the recommended video. All right. Well, that was really long and boring, but sometimes that's just the way it goes. I wish it was more interesting, but at least we had a Philip sighting. And that was basically it. There was a Philip. That was basically they didn't answer any of our questions, but if they had actually answered our questions, it would have been a more productive exercise. So you know what, guys, you win some, you lose some. This was Socialism Live. We didn't know what was going to happen. It could have been much more interesting than it was. I'm sorry if everyone was bored, but you know what? We had our fun in the chat. Shout out Josh Randall for Josh Randall sending $110 for the super chat. That's okay. Some socialism is going to be boring. It is what it is. If we get our questions answered eventually, then that's good. And now Philip knows that we're watching again, which, you know, we planted the seed into Philip's head. But guys, that is all we have for right now. Now I have an important programming note. I am very sorry, but Joshua is not available to do our show tonight, and everything's fine. He's got a big assignment and a big thing he's working on, and it's really cool, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. But Joshua is not available to do Nothing Remotely Controversial tonight. And in addition to that, Joshua is having some misgivings about some of the things you guys are asking him to psychic. So we're going to be putting some rules in place, like in terms of not psychicking people's mental health, not psychicking if people are gay. Joshua is worried about karma coming back to bite him for this. And so we got to put some rules in place to keep Joshua happy, okay? Because if he feels like he's going to get karma because people are asking nutty questions, then he's not going to do the show anymore. And he doesn't want that because it could, in his words, legitimately fuck up his life. And so we have to keep Joshua happy. We're going to put some rules and guidelines in place, but he is fine. He's working on a cool project tonight and he's not going to be able to do the show. So I may do another stream. I may. I'm not guaranteeing anything, but I feel like I need to watch something stupid, to be honest. Like, I feel like I need to watch something dumb, not the Whatever podcast, but like, I feel like I need to come down from the level of like intellectual nonsense that we just endured for 2 hours. And so I might do another stream later. I might. Not guaranteeing anything. I also might just work. I also might just do podcasts. I might just do that. In the meantime, guys, please make sure you follow me on Twitter if you want to find out if I'm doing another stream later. I don't want to watch Tim Pool. I don't want to. Okay. Also, please make sure you are subscribed to the Substack, which is of course Carlyn KARLYN.substack.com. And that is where you can find all my podcasts and all my articles and all that stuff. And maybe I'll see you guys later, and maybe I won't. But I will definitely see you tomorrow if I don't see you later again tonight. Take care, guys. Have a good one. We'll see you soon. Bye.